Time to take a look at German medical service in the Second World War, particularly the process wounded soldiers went through from the front line to the field hospital or beyond if they needed further care. So we look at the military medical treatment chain. For this we look primarily at a German book from 1943 because on this channel I do my own research with proper sources, which is made possible by my various supporters via Patreon and Subscribestar. So let us look at the basic process that a wounded and ill soldier in the German army would go through. Note, this is for a regular infantry division. The source particularly notes that for panzer divisions and motorized divisions there would be a difference. Now we start on the left side where the front line was, and on the far right basically the home front starts. As you can see, there are various stations in between, so let us look at the whole process. Be aware that the German medical doctrine differed from British, American and modern doctrine in various ways. As such, even if the terminology might be the same, there is likely a difference on what happened at different points. At the combat area, after the initial treatment, the soldier either moved on their own or were moved by comrades into cover. In some cases, this led to the creation of collection points for wounded. These were called Verwundetennest, literally meaning wounded man nest, probably best translated as casualty collection point. Note that the term nest for the German military was often used for a position with several soldiers. The next step was the Truppenverbandplatz, literally troop dressing place. Best translation is probably unit dressing station or aid station. This was the lowest level of professional healthcare with a medical doctor. The physician in charge was the Truppenarzt, literally troop physician. He was the medical officer in a battalion. Depending on the condition of the wounded, he moved here on his own or was moved here by men from the medical company or dedicated litter bearers of the unit, Krankenträger der Truppe. It was noted that the location of the unit dressing station should be located as close as possible to the front line but secure from most enemy fire. Additionally, it should provide good access for transportation. The unit dressing station was usually in the field and not in a building. For the physician at the unit dressing station, it is noted, in such a situation it is not important for the doctor at the unit dressing station or another medical facility to save an individual life through measures that are urgent for the individual wounded and perhaps also promising, but time consuming, while the mass of wounded meanwhile lose irretrievable time without treatment. The doctor must rather keep the greatest benefit for the mass of the wounded in mind, if necessary at the conscious sacrifice of a single wounded person, a painful compulsion for every true doctor. As such, a key task is to determine the priority for transport and the selection of the next station, namely the collection point for lightly wounded, the main dressing station, Hauptverbandplatz, or field hospital, Feldlazarett. The next stage was usually the main dressing station, Hauptverbandplatz. In most cases, the first place for specialist medical and surgical assistance is the main dressing station. This is set up by a medical company, as is the light casualty assembly point, which is usually attached to it, but it is somewhat remote from it. As a rule, each division has two medical companies. Depending on the type of unit, both are motorized or horse-drawn, or one each is motorized and horse-drawn. Usually it was about 4 to 6 kilometers away from the front line. Another source notes 4 to 5 kilometers. This was also the station where surgeons were doing their duty. The main objective was to either save the lives of the wounded or to create or improve the transport conditions of the wounded. Close to the main dressing station was the Leichtverwundeten-Sammelplatz, light casualty assembly point. So wounded that could still walk. After treatment, if the wounded were considered still combat capable, they were ordered to the front line again. All others would either move on foot or by transport to the Krankensammelstelle, patient collection station. Keep in mind that depending on the situation and infrastructure, the process might skip some of these stations. The original graphics had lines and dashed lines. From my understanding, the dashed lines indicate that the wounded could move on their own. The next major station was the Feldlazarett field hospital. To quote, "The main focus of the surgical work within the division is at the field hospital. It was about 10 to 15 kilometers behind the front line and had a capacity of 200 beds. It is noted that there the wounded, particularly operated patients, should be able to rest here for at least a few days. The treatment and care should be on the level of a regular hospital, although with improvised measures. Ideally, the field hospital was located in a hospital, but other buildings like school, public buildings, etc. could be used as well. Further behind, the already mentioned patient collection stations were used at various locations throughout the rear area, where concentrations of wounded were likely to form due to factors of location and infrastructure. In particular, collection stations were placed at locations where new selection process would take place to decide who would require transportation for further treatment. Note that surgical treatment was not performed at patient collection stations. The next major station was the Kriegslazarett, literally war hospital. This was the most important facility in the rear area. According to regulation, it should be able to treat 500 severely ill or wounded soldiers, although in some cases they were expanded up to 2,500. To quote from the book, "The most important facilities in the rear area of the army are the war hospitals. They are intended to provide hospital-like medical treatment and care. They have specialists in almost all fields and corresponding specialist departments. It will always be desirable and feasible to set up the war hospitals in larger or expandable hospitals, which should be taken into account as early as possible when determining the location. If the war hospital fulfills its task, the seriously injured person can possibly be treated here until he has recovered sufficiently and is fit for transport according to peacetime assessment. However, combat operations often force the hospital to free up a larger number of beds for the admission of newly expected wounded and to make transport indication accordingly more appropriate for wartime conditions." There was also a Leichtkrankenkriegslazarett, literally translated likely ill war hospital, probably best translated with war hospital for minor cases. It had an intended capacity of 1,000 soldiers. It was used to treat lightly wounded and ill soldiers that soon would be released to their units, which is indicated by the dashed line. Now, although in the graphics they are located near the war hospital, the text notes that they are ideally as far forward as possible in order to conserve transport space. So the visual representation next to the war hospital is due to organizational reasons, since both hospitals were part of a unit. Finally, the outside of the rear area and already from the home front, so off screen on the right, were Reservelazarette, the reserve or home hospitals, although it is noted that there might be hospitals in between as well. If the operations extend over very large areas, a war hospital base with well-equipped war or reserve war hospitals is inserted between the armies and the home area. This avoids excessively long transportation routes. Now, if you think this is complicated, keep in mind that this is actually a simplified version according to the original source. To summarize, in the German army, the smallest unit with a medical doctor and an infantry division was the infantry battalion. He decided that the unit dressing station were to move the wounded. The next major station was the main dressing station that performed life-searching surgery and or allow for further transportation if necessary to the field hospital, which performed the majority of the surgeries. The last stage of the hospital within the rear area was the war hospital, where medical specialists and equipment was available. If necessary for further treatment or due to a lack of capacity, there were also facilities within Germany, the reserve hospitals. Thank you to Christoph for providing help with basic concept and translation suggestions. Thanks to Andrew for reviewing the script.